March 6, 1474. He lived for 89 years. He toiled incessantly, defining his work, transforming his toil into art. Art of magnificent proportion, art of original stylistic conception, art that spoke of man's eternal spiritual being and profane reality. Architecture, painting, and sculpture. He mastered all three, when others around him slaved a lifetime to conquer one. Michelangelo Buonarroti, born in 1474 of a land-poor noble family that had fallen on hard times. His father earned a simple wage as a modest official in the service of Florence, with a large family hardly getting by. Shortly after Michelangelo was born, his mother was again pregnant, so Michelangelo was put out to a wet nurse in the stonecutter's family in Settignano, where, in his own words, he drew in the sound of hammer and chisel with his nurse's milk. Michelangelo lived with the stonecutters on and off for 10 years or so. His father then brought him back to Florence to send him to school, where he idled away his days drawing and painting and hanging around the numerous artists' workshops in the city. Florence itself became his teacher, and he studied its superb works of art with the close observation of the born artist. The cathedral dome, Giotto's campanile, and in his own parish church, Santa Croce, Giotto's frescoes and Donatello's Annunciation. He was reprimanded at school, beaten by his father, but nothing altered his desire to be apprenticed to some workshop to learn the artist's trade. Through a friend, Francesco Granacci, he was introduced into the workshop of Domenico Ghirlandaio and finally persuaded his father to let him be apprenticed. Ghirlandaio was engaged on his frescoes of the birth of the Virgin in Santa Maria Novella, and Michelangelo started learning the technique of fresco. Indeed, two of the figures in the fresco are attributed to him, and Domenico is said to have been somewhat jealous of his pupil. His jealousy was not without cause. Soon, Michelangelo came to the notice of Lorenzo the Magnificent, the ruler of Florence, who decided he wanted the boy to work in his sculpture studio and persuaded his father to let him do so. Lorenzo treated the boy as a son, and Michelangelo was absorbed into the splendors and learning of the Medici court. From the foremost scholars of the day, he learned of Plato, of Dante, and Petrarch. He continued to study the techniques of the great artists working in Florence. In the church of Santa Maria del Carmine, Masaccio's frescoes, the young artist admired these greatly and made copies of his favorite works, the tribute money and the expulsion of Adam and Eve. Above all, he learned the technique of stone carving. From this period come his first two carvings, the Battle of the Centaurs, which illustrates an antique fable and shows him grappling with the naked human body in violent pagan action. The Madonna of the Stairs presents a direct contrast, the spiritual and divine, two polarities which seem to represent a constant in Michelangelo's art. Lorenzo died in 1492, leaving Michelangelo bereft and Florence uneasy. Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican monk, was rousing the citizens with his denunciations of their impious ways. Michelangelo was secretly and deeply affected by his fiery sermons. He knew full well that Savonarola and his followers would associate him with what they conceived to be the decadence of the Medici court. So he took refuge in the church of Santo Spirito, where the prior gave him permission to dissect the corpses in the hospital morgue so that he could study the anatomy of the human body. The stench of the corpses made him ill, and he was agonized by a sense of sin, but he was determined to understand and draw. In gratitude to the prior, at 17 years of age, he carved a wooden crucifix that, in his own words, arose from the dead bodies I had desecrated. Slender, calm, and bearing the boyish innocence of Michelangelo's tender age, it was to be his only carving in wood. With the threat of a French invasion of Florence, the Medici rulers went into exile, and Michelangelo, in panic, fled to Bologna. There he was befriended by and lived in the home of a nobleman of the family Aldovrandi, who shared his love of Dante, and commissioned him to make 3 little statues for the shrine of San Domenico in the cathedral. The statue of St. Proculus, the young warrior patron of Bologna, of St. Petronius, and the statue of an angel. Soon Michelangelo was traveling again. With an introduction from one of the Medici family, he went to Rome, and in 2 years had firmly established his reputation. Rome at the time was rediscovering its past. Ancient ruins, excavation and restoration of antiquities were the vogue. Roman patrons clamored to enrich their collections of ancient art. A Roman banker named Jacopo Galli gave Michelangelo his first commission for a statue of the Roman god Bacchus, to be done in the classical style. And it was through Galli that Michelangelo received the commission for the Pietà for St. Peter's, the work which was to make his name famous throughout Italy. So confident was the brash young Michelangelo that he guaranteed in contract that this would be the finest work in marble that there is in Rome today. When it was installed, it was received with immediate and widespread acclaim. His name and reputation now established, Michelangelo returned to Florence, where commissions began to come in. In 1501, a competition was announced for sculptors to submit plans for a 19-foot piece of marble to be made into the figure of David for the cathedral authorities. The great master Leonardo da Vinci himself was one of the competitors. At 27 years of age, Michelangelo won the competition, and 3 years later, the work was completed and the David unveiled to rapturous applause from the citizens. Between 1503 and 1505, Michelangelo made several versions of the Madonna and Child, a sculpture in marble known as the Bruges Madonna. Another marble commissioned by Bartolomeo Pitti. And a painting of the Holy Family made for the wedding of Agnolo Donni and Maddalena Strozzi. The City Council of Florence asked Michelangelo to do a huge fresco of the Battle of Cascina for one of the walls of the Sala di Consiglio in the Palazzo Vecchio. Leonardo da Vinci had been entrusted with the opposite wall. Neither was ever completed, and only these sketches remain of the Battle of Cascina. Another commission at this time for the cathedral was for statues of the 12 apostles, but again, these works were not completed, and only the St. Matthew was begun. For all work in Florence was abruptly halted when in March 1505, Michelangelo was summoned to Rome by Pope Julius II, the first of a long line of popes who were to consider the services of the great sculptor as essential to their image. Julius was one of the great Renaissance popes, a man of imperious character. He commissioned Michelangelo to design and carve his tomb. Michelangelo went about his commission with high-minded enthusiasm, sketching and planning a work of grandiose proportions. At their initial meeting, hopes were high, and Michelangelo went off to Carrara for 8 months to choose his marble blocks. On his return, however, the Pope's mind had been set off the project. Now he was filled with another great scheme, this time for the decoration of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. "Our great ceiling is barren," he said. Michelangelo resisted. Painting, he told the Pope, was not his trade. "I am a sculptor, not a painter." The proud and willful Pope insisted. Michelangelo stubbornly held out. The Pope doubled his fee and then further conceded to allow the artist complete freedom to paint what he liked. The ceiling was immense, vaulting high and empty, the challenge awesome. He had not painted a fresco since his boyhood apprenticeship with Ghirlandaio, over 20 years before. The ceiling took 4 endless years to complete. Painting on his back, on a scaffold 68 feet in the air. Problems with assistants, the quality of the plaster, and his family constantly nagging him for money, accusing him of neglect, and generally bringing him to near despair. He wrote a sonnet on the agony he endured and sketched himself lying on his back on the edge of the page. The Pope, too, asked him constantly, "When will the work be finished?" "When I am satisfied with it," replied Michelangelo. The chapel was reopened in 1512. Pope Julius died in 1513 with barely enough time to absorb the brilliance and scope of the work he had commissioned. His family insisted that Michelangelo return to the unfinished work on his tomb, which he did for the next 3 years, creating the powerful and awesome figure of Moses. Pope Julius was succeeded by a Medici. In fact, Lorenzo's son Giovanni was ordained Pope Leo X. A call came almost immediately from the new Pope for Michelangelo to finish the facade of the Church of Lorenzo in Florence, the Medici family church. For 3 years, Michelangelo planned, designed, went off not to Carrara, but to the rugged mountains of Pietrasanta in search of a new marble. Those frustrating, difficult years were wasted. For in one imperious act, Leo X simply abandoned the project in 1518 and switched his interest to a tomb for the Medici family. Italy was ripped by political and religious turmoil. In 1523, Leo X died and was succeeded by Clement VII. In 1527, Rome was sacked and burned by an army of mercenaries flying the banners of the Holy Roman Emperor, but in fact motivated by Martin Luther, who sought to reform all of Christendom. Michelangelo believed in the free, self-determined Republic of Florence, and in 1529 decided to help the people build the fortifications of Florence and fight off the Medici onslaught led by the armies of the Pope. Their fight was futile. In 1530, the Medici were restored, and Michelangelo fled for his life. Rather than leave the city, he remembered from his youth in the Medici court an underground passage, the sotterraneo, connecting the chapel to the palace. There he hid, for 90 days. Living only on water and crumbs of bread, he began to draw on the wall with frenzied determination as the rioting continued in the streets above. When the Civil War had subsided, Pope Clement, eager to have the work in the Medici tomb completed, pardoned Michelangelo and decreed that he should be left at liberty and treated with courtesy. So he returned to his work on the tomb and the Laurentian library. 10 long years of work lay ahead before the Medici tomb would be completed. A magnificent altar for the silent dead, representing the sorrows of human time, contrasted with the harmony of eternal time. When it was complete, Michelangelo plunged into his work on the Laurentian library, located immediately above the tomb. An assault on the senses, the antidote for Michelangelo's long years of work in the tombs below, a strong, stately tribute to life and learning. Michelangelo was working on another figure for the Julius tomb, Victory, when he was visited by a young nobleman, Tommaso de Cavalieri, with whom he formed a lasting friendship. He dedicated a number of drawings and sonnets to this young man, who seemed to have enriched Michelangelo's outlook and opened a fresh period of creativity for the now aging master. Pope Paul III, who succeeded Pope Clement in 1534, was determined to have Michelangelo in his service. He appointed him chief architect, sculptor, and painter at the Vatican, and commissioned the Last Judgment for the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel. Work began in 1535 and finished in 1541. This was another difficult and wrenching time for Michelangelo. He was 67 years old, and the demands that this fresco placed on him were too much to bear. Finishing the Last Judgment drove Michelangelo to a state of mental and spiritual turmoil. Yet, during this period, in his studio, work on a sculpture still continued. The head of Brutus was completed. And he met Vittoria Colonna, who consoled him and brought him closer to religion than ever before in his life. She was a deeply religious woman, and he made a number of drawings of the crucifixion for her. Some of his most beautiful sonnets are addressed to her. O happy soul, my evening star, an old man's heart so close to death you keep alive with comfort and tenderness. For the next 8 years, between 1542 and 1550, he worked on 2 frescoes in the recently completed Pauline Chapel. On one wall, the Conversion of St. Paul. On the opposite wall, the Crucifixion of St. Peter. And he brought at long last to conclusion the last two figures for the tomb of Julius II. These were, in addition to Moses, Leah and Rachel, the active and the contemplative life. He had also been appointed chief architect of St. Peter's, and his major concern was the rebuilding of St. Peter's, for which he left drawings and designs and a wooden model of the famous dome, the completion of which he was not destined to see. During his last years, he worked on 3 Pietas, often at night by the light of a candle stuck in his hat. The Pietà now in the cathedral at Florence, which he had intended for his tomb, he mutilated just as it was finished. It was restored by a fellow sculptor. The second was the Palestrina Pietà, and that too was finished by another hand. The last, which was in his studio when he died, is known as the Rondanini Pietà. That too is unfinished, as he changed his ideas and knocked off the head of Christ, forming a new one from Mary's shoulder. An arm hangs loose on one side. His life has come full circle. From the proud and confident Pietà of his youth to the tragic and intensely moving Pietà of his old age. Michelangelo was 89 when he died on February 18th, 1564. Mary, the Mother of God and the guardian of his death, is seated upon the rock on which his church is founded. The child curls back into her body as if to hide from his destined life and death. Cherubim wind the Virgin's veil round the cross as a shroud. 5 steps, which St. Augustine called the stairway to heaven, by which Christ also descended to earth, spell M-A-R-I-A, Maria. Hercules battles against the centaurs, those mythical creatures half beast, half man. The figures twist and writhe, showing off muscle and sinew in a tangle of limbs, their faces turned to the figure of Hercules with arm upraised. Michelangelo never parted with these two early works. They seem to represent not only his alphabet of forms, but the two sides of Renaissance man, the pagan and earthly, realized by Michelangelo in his glorifying of the human nude, and the spiritual and divine, fearful of death and damnation, which became more and more evident in his work as he grew older. The prior of the Church of Santo Spirito gave Michelangelo permission to dissect the corpses in the hospital morgue to understand better the human body. How profane, how difficult this was for this pious man. One should not violate the dead. The stench of the corpses made him ill, and he was agonized by a sense of sin. But he went on dissecting and learning. Perhaps in reaction to the putrefying corpses he was dissecting at the time, Michelangelo gives his Christ figure the body of a young adolescent, delicate in structure, unsullied by his cruel death, relaxed as if in sleep. For 3 centuries, this crucifix was considered lost. It was rediscovered in 1962 in the refectory of the Church of Santo Spirito, covered with grease and blackened by smoke, unrecognized for all those years. The 3 figures Michelangelo was asked to carve for the tomb are St. Proculus, St. Petronius, and an angel with candlestick. They reflect a freedom of expression and a fluency in the carving of the drapery which show the influence of Jacopo della Quercia, the sculptor of the figures on the facade of St. Dominic. Thought by some to be a self-portrait, the warrior patron of Bologna stands guard over the bones of the saint, glaring out at those who might approach the sanctuary. St. Petronius, carrying a model of his city, seems to levitate heavenwards, propelled by some inner force. The angel is still buoyant from his flight, absorbed by the solemnity of his mission. The grandeur that was Rome reawakened in Michelangelo the spirit of the antique, which he had absorbed during his stay at the Medici court. The god of wine and fertility is ripe with the sap of the earth and the warmth of the sun. His body, like the vine, sways tipsily. Clusters of grapes grow in his hair. Eyes veiled with the mists of his drunken state, the god of the grape will, after the harvest, sink slowly into the long sleep of winter. His satyr companion nibbles at the grape clusters. The lion skin mask reminds us of death before the spring's reawakening. Mary sits on the foundation stone of the church. At the feet of her son lie the stump of the tree of life and the wood of the cross. Her lap is the altar on which Christ is sacrificed. Mary, the Virgin Mother of God incarnate, remains forever young, while Christ, who has taken on the mantle of man, has become older than she. Michelangelo must have known St. Bernard's prayer to the Virgin. Virgin and Mother, daughter of your Son, humble and exalted above all creatures, fixed goal of God's will. Michelangelo made hundreds of drawings for the competition to win the contract to do a statue of David in Florence. Only a few remain. Most of his working drawings were destroyed, along with the wax models he made before starting the work. David was conceived as a symbol of the Florentine Republic. He is poised for action, his left hand grasping the stone he's about to sling at the enemy. His brows are violently contracted, the nostrils tense, the eyes watchful and defiant, the whole figure more of a god than a civic hero. In David, Michelangelo first displayed the quality of terribilità, the spirit-quelling, awe-inspiring force for which he became known. When challenged by some that his David was too nude, he replied that there were those who thought the shoe more important than the foot. David was placed on the steps of the Palazzo Vecchio and was always known by the citizens as the Giant. The Bruges Madonna and Child is one of 4 works on the subject which Michelangelo did at this time. Mary sits in solemn contemplation of the tragedy to come. The child timidly takes the first steps out into the world while clinging to his mother's hand. The wheeling movement of the composition, from the draperies to the child's body to the Virgin, is held steady by the block-like form of the Virgin, her head breaking through the circular frame, carrying heaven's emblem, the cherub, symbolizing divine knowledge. Michelangelo's earliest surviving painting. He believed that the closer painting came to sculpture, the better it was. And the central group in the Doni Tondo gives an impression of carved relief. It is linked to the frieze of nude figures by the little figure of St. John on the right. The painting has been interpreted as a synthesis of man's pagan past with the biblical present, with St. John foretelling the coming of the Savior. Yet another commission about this time from the Signoria of Florence was to decorate one wall of the council chamber in the Palazzo Vecchio, the opposite one having been given to Leonardo da Vinci. Neither scheme ever materialized, though it is known that cartoons of the designs existed. Michelangelo chose an episode from the war between Florence and Pisa, when 400 Florentine soldiers were surprised bathing by English troops. This gave Michelangelo the opportunity to experiment with all facets of the nude body in action. Michelangelo was commissioned by the cathedral authorities to carve 12 apostles for the cathedral. Only one was ever started, and that is unfinished. The saint appears to be growing his soul is alive in there and waiting to be liberated. Michelangelo defined sculpture as the art that works by the force of taking away. In one of his poems, he writes, "Lady, in hard and craggy stone, the mere removal of the surface gives being to a figure which ever grows the more the stone is hewn away." Michelangelo used to attack his marble block with controlled fury, and one witness says that even at 60, he was able in a quarter of an hour to knock more chips than 3 young stonecutters could do in 3 or 4. He was 32 years old when he quit working on the St. Matthew. The tomb as finally installed in the Church of St. Peter in chains. Only Moses and the 2 flanking figures are by Michelangelo. A far cry indeed from the grandiose scheme which Pope Julius II and Michelangelo originally conceived in 1505. Once the design was set, he went to the marble quarries at Carrara to choose the blocks he would need. He was there for 8 months. The Pope seems to have lost interest in the scheme. Michelangelo did, however, start on a number of statues for the scheme, almost all of which never finished up in the final version of the tomb. Moses is the dominating figure in that final version. Those who have not seen this statue, wrote the French writer Stendhal, cannot realize the full power of sculpture. Moses has returned from his sojourn with Jehovah. The tablets of the law lie under his right arm. He will chastise the people of Israel for their sins and restore God's commandment. In Moses lies all Michelangelo's power to express moral force through physical presence. Two other figures were done at about the same time: the dying slave and the rebellious slave. These two figures were given to the Strozzi family, in whose palace Michelangelo was nursed back to health in 1544. They were then taken to France as a present for Francis I. Michelangelo worked on the four captives over a long period, and how far they are really unfinished or how far he chose to leave them in their present state is a matter for conjecture. The film has Atlas. These figures, like the early St. Matthew, also struggled to emerge from the stone as a man might emerge from water. Michelangelo appears to have worked inwards from the sides of the block, and his chisel marks are clearly visible. One interesting observation made by Vasari is that Michelangelo worked equally well with both hands, and the way the strokes are hatched and crossed upon the marble remind one of a pen drawing. When carving this figure, Michelangelo may have been put in mind of Dante's lines in the 10th canto of the Purgatorio. The proud carry huge slabs of stone to compress their swollen pride and force them to bend low in humility. O ye proud Christians, wretched souls and weary, who by the dim light of your twisted minds believe you are winning even as you fail. Can't you see we are but worms, each born to become an angelic butterfly that soars naked to the throne of judgment? The figure is given extraordinary dynamism by the powerful twist of the torso. The head is averted, as if scorning his success, the triumph of youth over old age, the bowed figure of Michelangelo himself. Possibly intended as one of the figures sketched in at the extreme right of the tomb, the figure has a languid beauty, offset by the powerful movement of the left arm. This work was never finished. Possibly intended as one of the figures sketched in at the extreme right of the tomb, the figure has a languid beauty offset by the powerful movement of the left arm. This work was never finished. One of the two figures on either side of Moses in the final version of the tomb. Leah represents the active life, her hands ready to prepare an offering for her Lord. Rachel represents the contemplative life, eyes raised to heaven, seeking grace and salvation. Michelangelo's great frescoes on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. For his ceiling, Michelangelo designed a vast architectural framework in paint with jutting pilasters, projecting cornices, and ribbed arches supporting his vision of a temple of heaven. By the time Michelangelo had received the commission to paint the ceiling, the walls of the chapel had already been decorated in fresco by the greatest masters of the age: Perugino, Cosimo Rosselli, Sandro Botticelli, Luca Signorelli, and Michelangelo's old master, Domenico Ghirlandaio. Michelangelo wanted his work to surpass all that had been done on the walls below. Pope Julius asked only that the 12 apostles be placed in the spaces above the windows. But for Michelangelo, every space and every niche brought another idea, another figure, a grander and grander vision of the universe. In the flattened surface of the central vault, he painted 9 dominant representations of the creation, the fall, and the flood. God dividing light from darkness. God creating the sun and moon and planets. God dividing the waters from the earth. The creation of Adam. The creation of Eve. The fall of man and his expulsion from Eden. Noah's offering to the Lord. The flood. The drunkenness of Noah. At each corner of the paintings are 20 young men, the famous ignudi, nudes, each expressing in face and body an astonishing display of the human form. In each of the four-corner spandrels, in spaces of a very odd shape, Michelangelo painted four subjects symbolizing man's redemption: the lifting of the brazen serpent in the wilderness, the punishment of Haman, David's victory over Goliath, and Judith with the head of Holofernes. Between the ribs of the vault at the ends of the smaller paintings, Michelangelo placed alternating prophets and sibyls, with Jonah at one end and Zechariah at the other, 12 potent witnesses to God's plan for the salvation of man. The Cumean Sibyl. Time has conceived, the ages start afresh, the Virgin comes back to dwell with us. Daniel, who proclaims, "The wind blows where it will, and you hear the sound, so will every one who is born of the Spirit." The Delphic Sibyl quotes from the oracle of Apollo, "One shall be born of a virgin, knowing no corruption." Jonah gazes upon God while pointing toward the Christ to come. He has spent 3 days in the belly of the whale, as Christ spent 3 days in his tomb before the resurrection. Ezekiel, "The heavens opened, and I saw visions of the glory of God." Zechariah prophesies the entry of Christ into Jerusalem, and he will build the temple of the Lord, the new Jerusalem. Joel, "Upon the miraculous gift of tongues will come the Holy Spirit." Libya, the Sibyl of Africa, "That which is hidden shall be revealed." Jeremiah is plunged in grief. His heart is broken because of the Lord. To complete the grand design, Michelangelo filled in the triangles between the sibyls and prophets with scenes representing the families of the Jewish people from the Old Testament, as he did in the lunettes above the windows. These are the ancestors of Christ. Michelangelo arranged his scaffolding so that he could paint 3 panels before moving it. At the beginning, he was beset with problems. He despaired of his assistants and finally dismissed them and worked on his own. The plaster grew molds. He tried to persuade the Pope to relieve him of the job, Painting wasn't his trade, he said, to no avail. So, 65 feet up, lying on his back, cramped and uncomfortable, Michelangelo embarked on his huge concept of human destiny. The creation of the world, the creation of man, the punishment of sin, according to the Old Testament. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the deep. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. And the Lord God breathed into him the breath of life, and man became a living soul. And the Lord said, "It is not good that a man should be alone." And he took one of his ribs, and the rib which the Lord had taken from man made he a woman, and brought her unto the man. And they were both naked, the man and his wife. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and the thoughts in his heart evil. And the Lord said, "I will destroy whom I have created." And he caused a great rain to fall upon the earth, and it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Michelangelo wrote this sonnet describing the pain and the anguish he endured for 4 years as he worked on the ceiling. "I've grown a goiter by dwelling in this den. My beard turns up to heaven, my nape falls in. My breastbone visibly grows like a harp. A rich embroidery bedews my face from brush drops thick and thin. My loins into my paunch like levers grind. My buttock like a crupper bears my weight. Crosswise I strain me like a Syrian bow. Whence false and quaint I know must be the fruit of squinting brain and eye, for ill can aim the gun that bends awry. Come then, Giovanni, try to succor my dead pictures and my fame, since foul I fare and painting is my shame." The scheme for the tombs of the Medici family underwent many changes before the final version was arrived at. The chapel was built between 1521 and 1524. The interior is itself a tomb, with the sarcophagi floating between the underworld and heaven. The gods of 4 rivers at the feet of the sarcophagi. These were abandoned. It seems that the plan was for each niche, now empty, to have a statue in it, and that the white walls should be decorated. Michelangelo was asked to provide sketches of what he intended after he had left Florence in 1533, but he never did so. As it is, the strange white spaces float in limbo. The blind doors lead nowhere, and the empty niches have a bleak poignancy. On one wall, the tomb of Lorenzo de' Medici, flanked by the figures of twilight and dawn. On the other, the tomb of Giuliano de' Medici, flanked by the figures of night and day. In both cases, the great weight of the figures seems to be forcing open the coffin on which they lie so as to release the soul of the Duke. Giuliano symbolizes the active life. Dressed in armor, his marshal's baton across his knees. But he, too, ponders the mystery of life and death. and the bat's ears, representing Hades, are prominent on his chest. Michelangelo was not carving portraits of the Medici. His figures are symbols of man's nature. Lorenzo of the contemplative life, though on what he meditates is for each observer to interpret. Night, the first of the four figures representing the passage of time which Michelangelo carved. She is haunted by her dreams, symbolized on her couch by the satyr of lust, the owl of anxiety, and the poppies of lost fertility. In a famous poem, Michelangelo expressed his own thoughts on the sleeping figure. Dear is my sleep, but more to be mere stone, so long as ruin and dishonor reign. To hear naught, to feel naught, is my great gain. Then wake me not, speak in an undertone. Day has been interpreted as a symbol of rebellion, as a personification of wrath and commitment, even as the city of Florence struggling against her invaders. It is certainly one of Michelangelo's most powerful figures, with its huge, twisted torso and furious expression. Dusk has come to the end of his day and contemplates the futility of it with resignation, his body slumped. Dawn seems the embodiment of melancholy, hardly able to face the sorrows of another day. Mary seems withdrawn both in body and spirit, her waist constrained by a knotted sash, while the child at her breast is swelling with a new force. Both the heads of the Medici dukes are turned toward this spiritual center of the tomb and the hope of salvation through God. And through the Son of God, the sorrows of the underworld and the tensions of human time are resolved in the harmony of eternal time as the souls of the dead rise to heaven. Michelangelo's sojourn in the vaults underneath the Medici chapel lasted 90 days, while the war for Florence raged above. As the architect in charge of defense of the Florentine Republic, he feared for his life once the Medici were restored to power. His inner turmoil and sorrow over a dead brother and friends preyed on his mind. He drew over 50 drawings on the wall, memories of past works, of present concerns, and of intimations of the future. All are there. This extraordinary chamber was only rediscovered in 1975 and is indispensable evidence for the study of his life and work. Michelangelo left many sketches for the library commissioned by Clement VII to house the Medici books. The building was unfinished when Michelangelo left finally for Rome in 1534, never to return to his native city, but there is no doubt that the major part of the design was his. A high, airless octagonal antechamber warns the non-serious student against mounting the staircase to the library. Long, forbidding columns lead nowhere. Blind windows keep out intruders. Brackets support nothing. And the only exit is the marvelous rolling tide of the staircase, which seems to descend lower rather than mount upwards. Michelangelo was asked to send detailed drawings of the staircase from Rome, but was only able to supply a vague description from a dream he had had. At the top of the stairs, a pedimented doorway leads into the library itself, a long, serene space in which to house the great repository of books, many by Michelangelo's first year at the court of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Pope Clement VII discussed with Michelangelo another fresco for the Sistine before his death in 1533, and some of the sketches date from that period. But it was Paul III who commissioned, in spite of Michelangelo's reluctance, a work for the west wall of the chapel, which would restore to the Catholic Church its authority over the faithful, which had been undermined by Luther and the Reformation. Michelangelo's great fresco triumphantly asserts the power of Christ's second coming. The wall seems to dissolve, and out of the void emerges the drama of the Day of Judgment. From the top stream angels bearing the instruments of the Passion, the cross, the crown of thorns, the nails and the sponge, the pillar of scourging, and the spear that shed his blood. Saints and martyrs carried the instruments of their torture and death as proof of their faith. Michelangelo put his own self-portrait on the flayed skin of St. Bartholomew. Catherine has her wheel, Lawrence his grill. Below them, the damned tumble to their doom, struggling rebelliously against their fate. One titanic sinner is dragged down by his own demons. Charon herds his boatload of hapless victims to the judgment of Minos, king of the underworld. The dead start emerging from their tombs. They put on flesh and stare in astonishment at their rebirth. Death is vanquished. His reign is over. The saved, defying gravity, rise slowly towards their savior. The elect already have their place around the Son of God. The Virgin Mary, crouching by Christ's side, turns her head away as if unable to bear the execution of justice without mercy. Michelangelo seems to have made only one sculpture during this period, a head of Brutus, which for once combines human character with symbolic attributes of moral grandeur. The chapel was built by Antonio da Sangallo, the younger, for Pope Paul III. And Michelangelo's next commission was for 2 frescoes to decorate the walls. As he was journeying on the road to Damascus, the noonday silence was shattered by a lightning bolt. Paul fell to the ground, blinded. His horse bolted. Of his companions, Paul related, some saw the lightning but didn't hear the voice. Others heard the voice but didn't see the lightning. The voice telling me, "I am Jesus of Nazareth whom you are persecuting. Get up and go on to Damascus. There you will be told all the tasks that are laid upon you." St. Paul's figure is propelled outwards towards the spectators. His blindness is an inner blindness, which applies to all mankind, and to Michelangelo himself, who gives to Paul's face his own features. The landscape of the painting is bleak. Damascus can just be seen over the hill to the right. St. Peter's searching gaze challenges all those around him and all those who come to see the fresco. Emperor Nero had ordered him to be crucified upside down, but with a majestic effort of willpower, St. Peter wrenches himself upright and affirms the authority of the church, the rock on which the crucifix rests. Pilgrims arriving from all directions form a circular procession round the rock, spiraling inwards towards St. Peter and controlled by his indomitable will. Michelangelo's own inner preoccupation with religion and salvation is reflected in two self-portraits in the fresco. As a young man, he is standing behind the Roman commander on horseback who is pointing to St. Peter, as if accusing Michelangelo of being a party to his crucifixion. His pointing arm and the arms of the cross lead to the figure of an old man dressed as a Roman captive, reflecting that he, as had St. Peter, denied his Lord and was guilty of the sin of pride and arrogance. But the task that really concerned Michelangelo in his last years was the rebuilding of St. Peter's. He was a architect in 1547, inheriting a number of plans by famous names: Bramante, Raphael, Sangallo, Peruzzi. Of these, he concluded that Bramante's plan of 1506 was clear and simple, full of life and beauty, and his own design took that as its base, a Greek cross and square. But it's the dome which became central and achieved glory of Peter's, which was changed very considerably in building from Michelangelo's original design. Michelangelo believed that all art should express a moral order, a religious belief, evidence of the creator's grand design. And he strove in all his work to give a meaning beyond the physical forms. Preoccupied by day with architecture, Michelangelo returned in sculpture to the theme of the first work that made his name, the Pietà. The mood is one of resignation and death. Christ's right arm protects Mary Magdalene, whom he pardoned and who loved him well. His left is supported by his mother. Their heads touch, their bodies merge, while Nicodemus above them, the features of Michelangelo himself, gazes tenderly down on the sorrowing group. Painting nor sculpture now can lull to rest my soul that turns to his great love on high, whose arms to clasp us on the cross were spread. Almost certainly a later work than the Florentine Pietà, not all scholars are convinced that this work is by Michelangelo's own hand. It's not mentioned in any of the contemporary documents. Pietà, known as Rondanini, was in Michelangelo's studio when he died, and according to a witness, he was working on it all day long, a mere 6 days before his death. That his ideas on it were changing is evidenced by the detached right arm and by the recent discovery of the original head, which Michelangelo must have knocked off. The present head is carved out of the Virgin's shoulder, completing the fusion of the two bodies in spiritual union after death. Begging his friends to remember him in his hour of death, Michelangelo bequeathed his goods and substance to his family, his body to the earth, and his soul to God.